You're sitting by the glass like you're in an aquarium. There is water outside. Large drops beat on the panoramic windows of the terminal like a drum roll. The glass shakes, reflecting flashing lights running along the platform. The headlights slice through the downpour like a knife through a thick cloth and immediately dissolve into a gray veil. A soft voice in the speakers announces the delays of neighboring flights, and you catch yourself with a strange feeling. Inside it is dry, warm, smells of coffee and fresh pastries. And behind the glass there is an element that easily turns thousands of horsepower into an obedient toy of aerodynamics. A fiery flash of lightning, and immediately the water takes revenge. Muffled thunder rolls low, like a distant engine. Nearby, parents are trying to persuade the child, "Let's take off. Don't be afraid." In the next seat, a man is flipping through the flight plan on the screen, routes, points, trains. Someone is used to living by numbers when the air roars around. But there's still one question in my head. What if this front doesn't go away? What if he doesn't just stand like a wall by the lane, but seems to be following every turn, every descent, cutting off options like scissors from the edge of the map? In good weather, an airplane is an accurate tool, obedient and predictable. In such a situation, every inch of the sky needs to be bargained for. Height, speed, time, fuel. You look up, and through the glass you can see a tow truck pushing a wide body car into the lane. A hulk with a wing where the fuel is whole pools, the engines are like the turbines of a power plant, and in the cockpit there are two people who have to pack the chaos into a procedure. The contrast is extremely simple. Outside, there is noise, a glint of water, chaotic gusts. Inside, in the cabin, everything should be the other way around. Quiet, even, step by step. There is no room for guesswork, only calculations. Water is running down the hull, but the thrust fire is ready to cut through this front, if the math coincides with reality. At such times, it's time to get thick. There are lines on the scoreboard: wind direction, visibility, thunderstorm probability. For a passenger, this is a set of words. For the crew, it is a dynamic system where one parameter changes the scenario as a whole. A small arrow on the weather radar, a shift of several degrees, and an approach with an accompanying component turns into waiting, waiting into leaving, and leaving into a new denouement, where every minute is measured in kilograms of fuel. Pilots always have 4 baskets in their heads: air, space, time, and fuel. When one basket is empty, the rest must be replenished instantly. In such weather, they decrease together. On the platform, the technician rearranges the cones, as if arranging the pieces on the board before the endgame. And inside the terminal, someone laughs. "It's okay. The weather's going to clear up." Sometimes this happens. A thunderstorm will flare up and leave like a hot-tempered character, leaving behind a cool and clear sunset. But it happens otherwise. The front does not go away, it moves. And if the plane gets into the same rhythm with him, any attempt to slip through turns into a dialogue with nature in raised tones. Imagine this moment from the cockpit. The controls are calm, the buttons are cold, the checklist sounds familiar. Green inscriptions on the screens promise order, and the weather radar draws an orange-red mosaic on the horizon as a warning: carefully. Inside is a fragile island of control. Outside is the shifting geography of rain. And somewhere between 5 more minutes, and we need to decide now. That fine line is born that separates a successful landing at the destination from a competent departure to where the lanes are drier and the wind is an ally, not a rival. What if the front doesn't disperse, but seems to be following you? What if every new turn brings you back to the same place, to the rain lane, where visibility drops faster than the indicators manage to soften the numbers? The response will begin in the Heathrow briefing room. A small room in the Heathrow building. Desks, soft lamplight, folders and tablets with electronic routes. There is no rain, thunder, or flashing lightning, just numbers and forecast lines. The crew receives a briefing package: weather reports, NOTAMs, fuel calculations, arrival and departure charts. Everything is clear and familiar. On paper, the flight looks simple. Departure in the evening, almost 13 hours across half the planet, and arrival in Singapore at a convenient daytime. The weather along the route promises to be calm. Europe is without major fronts. India and the Andaman Sea are the usual cloud layers, and thunderstorms are forecast in the late afternoon near the endpoint, as they almost always are. Singapore greets them as familiarly as London fogs. The forecast says, short-term, local visibility above the minimum. It means that entry is possible, and even alternate airports, Kuala Lumpur, Pai Labar, Sinai, promise similar conditions. Local thunderstorms, but everything is within acceptable limits. Here the first contradiction appears. On the one hand, there is confidence. Forecasts are consistent, and alternatives are prescribed. On the other hand, experience. Thunderstorms do not follow the calendar and rarely follow the forecast line by line. They are difficult to predict. They flash and disappear as suddenly as lightning in the sky. And every pilot knows. The numbers on paper are just a guideline. Reality corrects the flight plan. The second block is fuel. The plan shows figures that seem to be cut out with compasses. Taxiing, route, mandatory reserve of 3 or 5%, mandatory amount for departure to an alternate airfield, emergency minimum. This time, everything looks even with a margin, 166 tons for departure. This means that when arriving in Singapore, there will be about 7 tons left, almost twice the minimum allowed. And the crew's decision is not to order additional tons. Dry logic. Excess fuel means extra weight, which means more consumption and more emissions. And in the modern aviation world, both economics and ecology play a role no less than statistics. The commander is a man with 15,000 hours under his belt, almost 10,000 of them on this type, the Boeing 777. His partner is younger, but already with a serious touch, more than 2,000 hours on the same liner. Experience and youth, control and dynamics, the crew is balanced. The distribution of roles is classic. The co-pilot pilots the aircraft. The commander controls the process in order to intervene at the right moment and make a strategic decision. It's raining outside and the wind is booming. Inside, there is complete confidence in the plans and in the car. The Boeing 777 extended range is parked, with 2 General Electric engines, each pulling like dozens of locomotives. Inspection of the technical log, inspection of the skin, control of the systems. Everything is normal. No malfunctions, no restrictions. The flight is ready for the longest leg that can only be performed with passengers, an intercontinental flight through the night and morning, at a different time and a different climate. The contrast is increasing. There is water outside the window, and the crew has a plan with numbers and diagrams in their hands, where every line looks reliable. Everything seems to add up to a perfect picture. But it is precisely such moments in aviation that are insidious. When the forecast is calm and there is enough fuel, there is a feeling that the risk is minimal. But in fact, it is in this silence that a scenario is already being laid out in which random minutes of delay will cost hundreds of kilograms of fuel. And while the cabin is waiting for passengers and the flight attendants are preparing the cabin, the commander looks at the onboard control system and sees the route line: London, Asia, Singapore. A long, straight path through the dark sky. It seems that there is only routine ahead. But any experienced pilot knows that the most difficult thing always awaits at the end. And so, while it's raining on the concrete outside, confidence reigns inside. The paper says, everything is fine. But it is here, in the briefing room, that the hidden question is already being asked. What if the front in Singapore turns out to be stronger than forecast? If you ask a random passenger what enough fuel means, most will answer, to fly to your destination. But in the cockpit, everything is much more complicated. Fuel is not just liters in tanks. This is an algorithm scheduled by minutes and scenarios. For pilots, fuel is divided into blocks, as if into boxes, and each has its own meaning. The first box is a taxiway, something that burns down even before the wheels leave the concrete. It takes into account the movement from the parking lot to the lane and back after boarding. It seems like a small thing, but tens of minutes with the engines running turn into hundreds of kilograms. The second mailbox is an itinerary. This is the basis. That's the volume you need to go through all the levels from takeoff to landing in Singapore. In our case, this is almost the entire mass of fuel. Here, each kilogram is laid through optimal recruitment profiles, cruising and lowering. Then there's an unexpected percentage. 3 or 5% of the entire route. It would seem that it is not enough, but on an intercontinental flight, it is tons. This reserve is designed to absorb forecast inaccuracies, unexpected headwinds, an indirect route, or minor course deviations. The fourth box contains fuel for an alternate airfield. And that's where the fun begins. This block is a full-fledged mini-flight. Recruitment, cruise, descent, and landing at another airport. In our case, Kuala Lumpur or another of the 3 pre-selected. That is, even if Singapore closes, there is already a whole copy of the flight in the tanks, ready to take the flight away. And finally, the last box is an emergency minimum. You can't touch him. This is the holy of holies of fuel, the volume that allows the aircraft to stay in the air for another half hour at a waiting altitude. 30 minutes is not a random number. That should be enough time to assess the situation, contact the dispatchers, adjust the circuit, and still land safely, even if there is chaos around. And here is the main paradox. The more fuel you take, the heavier the plane. Heavier aircraft means higher fuel consumption. That is, you can load 10 tons more, but you will burn half of them just to carry yourself across the ocean. Economics and aerodynamics converge at a point where enough already means optimal. On the flight from London, the crew chose 166 tons. That's a lot, whole pools under the wings. In terms of flight minutes, more than 700. In terms of city trips, tens of thousands of kilometers by car. But for pilots, it's not the number itself that matters, but the remainder at the end. 7 tons at landing is a double reserve relative to the minimum limit. On paper, it looks ironclad, but as the delay drags on, the kilograms begin to disappear from the screen before our eyes. The Boeing 777 has a cruising fuel consumption of about 6 tons per hour, about 100 kilograms per minute. Seconds turn into tens of kilograms. Every weight, every departure for the second round minus hundreds. That is why fuel for pilots is not there or not. These are the hours and minutes of an airplane's life in the air, like an hourglass. The sand is constantly flowing, and the only question is where to turn the glass over so that it's enough. The dry numbers turn into drama only at the end. So far, they look almost perfect. The flight also promises to save on straightens over Europe. This means that they will arrive ahead of schedule and with an even larger balance. Everything is going better than expected, but there is an unspoken law in aviation. The smoother the start, the more likely it is that surprises await closer to the finish line. And that's where the numbers will stop being just a table and become the subject of a struggle. After a long taxiing at evening Heathrow, the liner enters the runway. 2 General Electric engines roar, spinning up to takeoff thrust. In the cabin, passengers feel the usual acceleration, and in the cockpit, the crew looks at the instruments. The speed is increasing, the course is stable, everything is in the green zone. After a few seconds, the heavy machine lifts off from the concrete and leaves into the night. In the first minutes of the flight, the numbers on the screens change rapidly. Speed, climb, fuel consumption. But as soon as the flight reaches the echelon, the pace stabilizes. What the passengers call routine begins, and the pilots call the cruiser. Cruising mode is almost the magic of engineering. The 2 engines are not running at maximum, but at optimal cruising thrust to combine speed and efficiency. On this type, the consumption is about 6 tons per hour. Imagine Every minute an airplane literally eats 100 kilograms of kerosene. Still, for pilots, it's peace of mind. The consumption corresponds to the calculation, the indicators are normal. And then a gift arrives from the dispatchers. Over Europe, the crew receives several route straightens. Translated into simple words, they were allowed to cut corners. There are no unnecessary queues in the sky, so you can walk more straight than planned. This saves not only minutes, but also hundreds of kilograms of fuel. The numbers on the fuel indicator screens become even more pleasant. If the initial planned stock was 7 tons at landing, now the forecast shows even more. Every minute of saving is working for them. The flight is going easier than expected, and it's like a warm wave of calm. Everything is under control. There's only a long stretch ahead through the night. Passengers are watching movies, children are falling asleep in their seats, and in the cockpit, the pilots are discussing upcoming work. The co-pilot will conduct the landing, the commander will observe and ensure. Everything is strictly according to the standard. The piloting machine performs most of the tasks. People make sure that the algorithms match reality. The contrast is obvious here. It's almost completely dark outside, with only stars and sparse lights under the wing. Inside the cabin, there is the steady hum of engines and the cold confidence of instruments. Hundreds of tons of metal are moving along an invisible corridor, like a train on rails. The screens show routes, points, and calculations. Everything is predictable, like a chess game where every move has been calculated for a long time. And it is in such moments that a paradox is born. The better the flight goes, the less reason for doubt. But experience tells us that too good in aviation is often a harbinger of change. Where the numbers promise an excess balance, the weather on the ground is already preparing its own adjustments. When the liner leaves Europe and sets course for Asia, the crew already knows that they are about half an hour ahead of schedule. The fuel supply is higher than the calculated one, and conditions at the train are stable. Everything is going perfectly, but the perfect cruiser is only half the story. The second half always starts at the bottom of the lane, when you need to combine mathematics with the unpredictable nature of the atmosphere. When Singapore is just over half an hour away, the crew contacts the approach. The dispatcher reports, ILS approach on lane 20R. Everything sounds routine. The co-pilot prepares the system, enters the scheme, the commander listens to the briefing. The cabin begins to announce an early landing. The atmosphere is calm, but it is at this point that the first deviation from the script arrives. At 8:05 a.m., passing an altitude of 15,000 feet, the crew is instructed to stand in the waiting area above the PASPA point. The reason is simple and clear. The tailwind component in the work lane has become too strong. There is a clear limit in aviation. Above 10 knots of tailwind, landing turns from normal to risky. Therefore, the dispatchers change the working direction of the runway. For pilots, this means extra minutes in the air. The waiting area is a standard procedure. An oval diagram appears on the FMS screen, and the aircraft begins to circle at a given altitude and speed. Everything looks clear and under control, but each lap means hundreds of kilograms of fuel. The commander looks at the weather radar. Where there should be a calm picture, the green and yellow spots are replaced by red ones. There is an active thunderstorm front right over Singapore. The precipitation cells stretch to the northwest, touching not only the main runway, but also the alternate airfields of Pai Labar and Sinai. Even the usual insurance is starting to melt away. There is a contrast here. The situation seems to be simple. You need to wait until the lane is reconfigured. But in fact, this is the first alarm bell. Every minute of waiting takes up fuel, and the front continues to move, closing the corridors. At this moment, the crew remembers the geography of the region. To the south, almost opposite Singapore, there is another airport, Hang Nadim on Batam Island. It wasn't listed as a spare, but it looks tempting now. The weather is clearer there, the lanes are longer, and if necessary, you can use it as a temporary landing point. It would seem that a solution has been found, but aviation doesn't like improvisations. Batam mainly serves medium-sized aircraft, and adopting a wide-body Boeing 777 means rebuilding the entire airport, parking lots, gangways, and fire departments. While the controllers are coordinating the possibility, the plane continues to spin in the waiting area, and the arrows of the fuel indicators are slowly moving down. It's raining heavily outside, and there's order and checklists inside the cabin. But this is just a semblance of calm. When the first landing is postponed, the crew knows that the time reserve has already begun to melt away. On the weather radar display, bright orange and scarlet spots grow as if alive. They do not stand still, but stretch like a chain of clouds, blocking the approaches to Singapore. For the crew, it's like looking at an X-ray photograph. The route lines still lead to the runway, but the colored cells directly say, "There's a wall of rain and turbulence waiting for you." In a normal situation, the pilot has a comfortable sense of choice. If it's bad in one direction, there's an alternate airfield to the side. But here the front has expanded so much that it seems to have closed several doors at once. And even the alternatives outlined in the plan, Kuala Lumpur and Paya Lebar, are under the same storm curtain. The contrast is especially noticeable here. The flight plan drawn up in London was like a chess game with several backup moves. But reality has shown that the pieces on the board have changed places. And if a calm voice in the briefing room said, "short-term thunderstorms," now these same thunderstorms stretch for tens of kilometers and seem to breathe towards the plane. The commander and co-pilot are calculating the options. Staying in the waiting area means believing in a speedy improvement. To leave right now is to lose the chance to land in Singapore and take passengers to a neighboring city. But each new radar scan shows that the front is not weakening. On the contrary, it is moving, and its trajectory leads exactly to where their unofficial hope, Batam, is located. This is where the psychology of flight manifests itself. Automatic systems continue to draw green route lines, fuel is still above the minimum, and procedures are being performed normally. But the feeling in the cockpit is changing. Every glance at the radar turns into a little what if. What if the storm lingers? What if the spare one goes out into the rain too? What if the fuel consumption is higher? Outside, passengers can only see the lights outside the window and the drops on the glass. Inside the cabin, two people are looking at a picture that no longer fits into the training scenarios. The front did not just block one corridor. He began to tighten the ring, leaving fewer and fewer safe routes to escape. And it is at this moment that the crew first has an idea. We need to look for a non-standard solution. Batam, although not officially listed in the plan, is becoming a potential key. It gives you a feeling of hope, a breath of air in the middle of a thundercloud. But the paradox is that it is precisely this choice that hides a new trap. On paper, the crew still has a choice. There are thousands of kilograms in the tanks. Calculations show the allowable balance, and the dispatcher's promise. The delay is insignificant. All this seems to be pushing the pilots to stay waiting. This is the classic trap, the belief that with a little more patience, the situation will resolve itself. The commander considers Batam as a backup option. It's only a few dozen miles away, you can go there quickly, and then, if the weather in Singapore improves, come back again. But the human factor is involved here. It seems wrong to give up so close to the goal. After all, the passengers bought a ticket to Singapore, not to the neighboring island. And even in the cockpit, there is an unspoken argument. We can handle it. It's worth waiting for one more lap. That's the contrast. The dry logic of fuel says, each lap in the waiting area costs hundreds of kilograms. The sooner we leave, the calmer we'll be. But psychology persuades us to stay, giving hope that the front will soon dissipate. And experience plays a double role. On the one hand, it teaches you not to panic, and on the other, it makes you believe in the best. based on past successful cases. There is an atmosphere of intense calm in the cabin. The co-pilot monitors the FMS readings. The commander listens to the broadcast. Along the chain, dispatchers coordinate lane direction changes and warn of thunderstorms. At this time, the red spots on the weather radar become denser. Their edges shift just in the direction of Batam. The chance is slipping away, but so far it looks real. Each new circle in the waiting area is like a deal with yourself. Just a little more, and everything will work out. But this is exactly how aviation incidents are formed. Not as a result of a single mistake, but through a series of small compromises that individually seem acceptable. And at that point, the fuel stops being just a number, turns into a stopwatch. Every kilogram is a second, every maneuver is minutes. The pilots continue to wait, although they already feel that the space around them is shrinking, and the choice is becoming tougher. Aviation has a special language. The same words spoken on the air can radically change the attitude of dispatchers to the situation. And it's all about fuel. While the plane is circling in the waiting area, the remainder is even higher than the emergency minimum. But calculations show that if you add another 5 minutes to the current delay, you will have to start using up the fuel that is intended for leaving for an alternate airfield. This is acceptable, but only up to a certain limit. This is where the first signal appears: minimum fuel. This phrase sounds calm, without panic. She doesn't give the plane priority. She just tells the dispatcher, "We are at a point where new delays are already critical." In fact, this is a warning. Every extra weight will eat up not the reserve, but the vital volume. But if the situation goes further, and it becomes clear that the plane risks landing with a balance below the emergency minimum, then a completely different word sounds: Mayday, Mayday, Mayday fuel. This is an emergency call. From this moment on, all lanes, all approaches, and all priorities in the sky begin to work only for this flight. The contrast is obvious. One word, minimum, is diplomacy, a gentle hint. The other, Mayday, is a switch, instantly switching the entire system into rescue mode. And it was in this waiting area that the crew of the Singapore flight began to realize that they were already approaching the border. Each round takes about 600 to 700 kilograms, and going to the second round will require about 1,000 more. The bill went not for hours, but for dozens of minutes. For the passengers in the cabin, everything looked familiar. We stay strapped in a little longer, maybe we circle over the city. No one thinks about the fact that every minute turns into hundreds of kilograms of fuel, dissolving in jets of hot gases behind the engines. In the cockpit, conversations become shorter. Less discussion, more numbers. And it is at such a moment that even an experienced crew can fall into another trap, to hope that the dispatchers will speed up their turn if they just wait a little. But heaven doesn't like compromises. Every minute of waiting made the difference between the words minimum fuel and Mayday fuel thinner. When the decision finally matures, the crew informs the dispatchers. There will only be enough fuel for one additional lap, then they will have to leave. A new map appears on the table: Batam Airport, the same Hang Nadim, where the weather is still favorable. But there is a caveat. Taking a heavy Boeing 777, there is not an easy task. For such an airliner, parking lots of the right size, ladders of sufficient height, fire and rescue services capable of working with a wide-body aircraft are needed. All this must be confirmed before the crew receives permission to leave. Therefore, the dispatchers begin to coordinate. They contact their colleagues in Tanjung Pinang, clarify the readiness of Batam. Takes time, and time is fuel. General Electric engines continue to burn 100 kilograms every minute. The arrows on the indicators decrease smoothly, but inexorably. For the cabin, it feels like an hourglass where the sand is leaving faster and faster. And then the irony happens. While the dispatchers are coordinating the possibility of reception, the front itself begins to shift to the south. The ribbon of thunderstorm cells that hung over Singapore is now stretching directly towards Batam. The place that seemed like salvation is turning into a new node of the problem. The contrast is striking. 5 minutes ago, Batam looked like an emergency exit from a trap, and now the storm seems to be deliberately catching up with the plane, closing this door. This is a typical catch-up game with an atmosphere where the speed of the liner is higher, but the space narrows faster than decisions can be made. In the cockpit, the commander asks for an additional lap, hoping to gain time for coordination. But each new maneuver brings the fuel needle closer to the dangerous line. The situation that started as just a delay due to the wind is now turning into a race. Who is the first to stay on the ground or to drop the remainder in the tanks below the critical level? On the radar screens, the front is turning redder and brighter, as if the air itself is hinting, "You're too late." And it is at this moment that the crew realizes. Now it is no longer they who choose the airfield, but the storm dictates where there will be an opportunity to land at all. When the controllers finally set a course towards Batam, a decision sounds in the cockpit that changes the dynamics of the flight. The commander announces that he will now be piloting, and the co-pilot will prepare for the approach, set up systems and maps. At first glance, everything is logical. The situation is tense, which means that the most experienced person should take over the management. But there is a nuance here. Normally, when leaving for an alternate airfield, it is more advantageous for the captain to remain in control. This allows you to keep all channels of information in hand: weather conditions, negotiations with dispatchers, communication with the cabin and cabin, preparation for new schemes. The co-pilot, while flying the plane, would have handled the handle and pedals just as well. And the commander, while maintaining a strategic position, would have more resources for analysis. Now, all the commander's attention goes into controlling the car. The huge Boeing 777 obeys the steering wheel, but requires constant precise work: roll, pitch, speed. At such heights and in such weather, any movement should be gentle but steady. And while the captain is focused on the horizon, the co-pilot is forced to simultaneously conduct radio exchange, set up FMS, and consult maps. This shows the contrast. Instead of distributed responsibility, the crew seem to have shifted the balance. The most experienced pilot is engaged in steering, while the younger pilot is engaged in navigation and negotiations. This is not a mistake, but a factor that reduces the overall attention span. Meanwhile, the dispatchers are still clarifying the possibility of admission to Batam. Seconds are running out. The engines continue to burn fuel. The red zones on the weather radar are getting denser, and their edges are already clinging to the approach corridor. Every minute they fly south increases the risk that this airfield will be under heavy rain. The feeling of a race is growing inside the cabin. The commander can physically feel the plane in his hands. Vibration, the response of the steering wheel, subtle fluctuations along the course. The co-pilot flips through the maps, reads the approach features. There is an ILS in Batam, but only on one lane, and they will have to enter via VOR. Automatic landing is not possible in these conditions. And yet the commander remains at the helm. Perhaps he decided that since the situation was beyond the standard scenario, it was better to keep the car himself. But this decision already affects the rhythm of the entire cabin. Now every action requires more coordination, and there is less time for reflection. When the Boeing 777 sets course for Batam, the crew receives the first weather data. The wind changes in leaps and bounds, gusts reach 30 knots, and all this with a passing component. For the passenger, these numbers mean nothing, but for the pilot it is already a signal. Such parameters go beyond not only the certification limits of the aircraft, but also the rules of the airline. Aviation likes headwinds. It reduces the speed relative to the ground, helps to run along the runway shorter, and gives the wing additional lift. A passing one does the opposite. It lengthens mileage, complicates control, and reduces safe reserves when touched. For the Boeing 777, the certification limit is 15 associated knots. For Singapore Airlines, it is even stricter, only 10. But now reality shows the figures twice as high. Nevertheless, the crew takes the liner to the glide path. The cabin is filled with cold concentration. The commander drives the car, the co-pilot talks through the checklists, adjusts the landing systems. On the indicators, the altitude is gradually decreasing. 3,000 feet, 2,000, 1,600. And it is here that the decision is made to retire to the second round. The autopilot turns off, the throttle levers move forward sharply. The 2G engines roar as if on takeoff. A large airliner lifts its nose and begins to gain altitude. For passengers, it feels like a sharp push back into the seat, as if the plane changed its mind at the last moment. In the cockpit, this is a planned maneuver, but with a heavy touch. Another 1,000 kilograms of fuel disappeared in a matter of seconds. The contrast is striking. I just had hope. We're on a straight line, we see a lane, and touchdown is coming soon. And at the same moment, another climb, another circle, another flow. It seems that the situation has frozen in one place, and the fuel arrows continue to creep down. But the most important thing in this moment is awareness. The crew understands that if the first approach ended in withdrawal, then each subsequent attempt will cost more. Fuel is melting, nerves are tense, and the storm is not thinking of dissipating. And while the liner is once again entering the waiting area, another word is already sounding in the cabin: low fuel quantity is getting closer. Now any decision becomes a step on thin ice, the risk of procrastination, and the remainder will go into the red zone. After the first lap, the crew decides. The next attempt will be using the ILS system in order to maximize the use of automation and take some of the load off the pilots. But the problem is that the approach maneuver is too short. The plane turns out to be only a few miles from the end of the runway, and you have to enter at an angle, as if you squeeze into a doorway without having time to straighten out. The ILS system is designed to pick up the aircraft far from the airfield. The heading and glide path radio beacons form a narrow corridor through which the autopilot guides the car until it touches down. But the closer the board is to the runway at the entrance to this corridor, the more sensitive the system becomes. Any extra roll or incorrect speed, and the ILS signal is perceived unstable. The commander still turns on auto-entry mode. For a second, it seems that the instruments are recording the signal. The arrows are aligned, the automation is ready to lead. But almost immediately, a warning flashes on the display: "No Autoland." This means that the algorithm does not have time to stabilize the approach. The entry angle is too sharp, the distance is too short, and the system simply cannot guarantee accuracy. The contrast is frighteningly sharp. A second ago, the crew had a feeling that the car itself would pick them up on the rails to the lane. And the next moment, the automation refuses. Now everything is in the hands of the captain, who simultaneously holds the helm and monitors the vertical speed. It reaches 1,300 feet per minute, too steep for a normal approach. The co-pilot pronounces the heights: 1,000 feet, 800, 600. The lane should be right ahead, but the rain hides it behind a wall of gray curtain. And then the contrast is back. The indicators show that they are above the glide path and to the left of the course. In other words, the plane is not moving in the center and with the wrong trajectory. The commander decides to leave again. The engines switch back to takeoff mode. The cabin fills with sound, and passengers feel a jolt. This is the second departure, and each such maneuver costs almost a ton of fuel. Now the balance is rapidly decreasing to the point where the low fuel quantity system is triggered. For the crew, this is a moment of realization. They can no longer rely on automation. In such conditions, even modern systems fail. All that remains is skill and cold calculation. But the fuel is running out faster than there is time for experiments. After the second departure, the air in the cabin seems to shrink. The pilots know that every minute and every 100 kilograms counts now. When the low fuel quantity alarm lights up, the situation ceases to be abstract. Now it is officially an emergency state recorded by the system. From this moment, a special checklist comes into force. Flaps for landing are no more than 20 degrees, although the standard for a heavy landing is 30 degrees. The reason is simple. In conditions of potential failure of both engines with complete fuel burnout, a smaller flap angle gives a chance to maintain speed longer and align the liner more safely. But the price for this is an increased landing speed and a longer runway run. For Batam, this is acceptable. There's a long runway there. When the crew tries the third approach, the trajectory already resembles acrobatics. The captain is forced to descend too sharply. The vertical speed exceeds 1,400 feet per minute, almost twice the norm. The indicators are starting to give alarm signals about the instability of the approach. And again, the decision to leave. This time it was from a critically low altitude, only 212 feet. For passengers, it feels like a sharp jolt. They have already seen the lights of the runway through the rain, and a few seconds later the plane shot up again, as if it had ejected. The vertical climb rate reaches 4,300 feet per minute. For a heavy Boeing 777, it sounds like a rocket, but this leap costs a huge expense. Another 1,000 kilograms of fuel disappears in a matter of moments. Now the numbers on the indicators frighten even seasoned pilots. The estimated tank balance is approaching the mark when less than a ton remains. And a ton on such a liner is only 10 to 15 minutes of flight, no more. The contrast becomes almost dramatic. A few minutes ago, it was about choosing a lane and the type of approach. Now we're talking about how many more times you can try. The arithmetic of fuel is inexorable, and every attempt is a risk of being left without the opportunity for a new one. It is at this moment that the commander realizes that the next approach must be the last. There will simply be no more opportunity to go to the second round. The plane turns into an hourglass, where the last grains of fuel slowly flow down. After the third departure, the commander clearly understands that it will not be possible to maneuver further. The remainder in the tanks is so small that it is enough for only one attempt, and so the solution sounds very clear. We get on lane 22, even if we have to enter visually without full automation support. Here again, the contrast shows up. A modern airliner equipped with sophisticated navigation systems has to rely on what the pilot's eyes see and what they can catch in the rain. Automatic scripts no longer help. Now human experience decides everything. The turnaround course is chosen so as to reach the pre-landing straight as quickly as possible, saving the last kilograms of fuel. The speed is kept higher than usual due to the flaps released only by 20 degrees. This means that the landing will be more rigid and the run will be longer. But there is no choice. Every minute is worth its weight in gold. The dispatcher reports the data. The wind is stable, 330 degrees with a speed of 15 knots. This gives a passing speed of about 6 knots, which is acceptable for the airline's rules. The commander takes this as a green light. Now the task is simple and at the same time deadly difficult: to bring the car to touch. When the plane goes into a straight line, the thunderstorm front shifts to the south, and the rain begins to subside. The lights of the strip are visible through the clouds. The co-pilot pronounces the heights: 1,000 feet, 600, 300. All the commander's attention is focused on the line of lights. The plane goes just above the glide path, but it doesn't matter anymore. The main thing is to get within the band. At an altitude of less than 200 feet, the familiar voice of the automatic system turns on, approaching minimums. But now it's not just a formality. Pilots know that the fuel in the tanks is running out. There can be no new departures. This is the real limit. The touchdown takes place at 17:19 local time. The wheels hit the wet concrete with a bang, and the reverse gear turns on immediately. There is a slight tremor in the cabin, and relieved sighs in the cabin. The plane rolls along the runway, and the fuel arrows show a figure that is less than the emergency balance. It is estimated to be about 1,000 kilograms and possibly less. Here again, the contrast is stark. The multi-ton car, which had just completed 3-second laps in a downpour and thunderstorm, is now calmly rolling along the taxiway as if nothing had happened. But the pilots know it was the last chance, and the supply in the tanks was dwindling before our eyes. When the airliner slows down and turns off the runway onto the taxiway, the atmosphere in the cabin changes dramatically. Outside, there is the usual airport rhythm. Escort vehicles, glowing beacons, flashing headlights on wet concrete. Everything looks familiar to passengers. We've landed, we're rolling to the parking lot, and we'll be able to get up soon. But for the pilots, every meter of this run is an awareness of how close they have come to the limit. Fuel indicators show a figure that is less than the legal minimum. Officially, this means that the landing was performed below the emergency balance. No big words, no panic, just the dry fact that the security reserve has been exhausted. In aviation, such moments are described very carefully. Landing with the remaining fuel below the calculated level. But behind this formulation is the fact that less than a ton could remain in the tanks. For a Boeing 777, it's only a 10-minute flight, and sometimes even less if you had to go on a second lap again. The contrast is striking. In the cockpit, there is fatigue and tension after long laps, automation failure, and 3 approach failures. And around the airport, life goes on as usual. Technicians work on the platform. Arrivals are coordinated in the control room. None of the passengers realize how thin the line was between a routine flight and an emergency situation. For pilots, this is not just a flight, but an important lesson. They know that in such circumstances, every decision needs to be made sooner than it seems necessary. It is better to go to a backup in advance and spend a little more fuel in a calm environment than to squeeze out the last kilograms in a race with a storm. But this time, everything ended well. The wheels touched the concrete, the plane stopped, which means that the task was completed. And yet, when the doors opened and the passengers started to get out, the commander and co-pilot stayed in their seats a little longer than usual. Because for them, landing below the emergency balance is not just a fact in the report, but a feeling that the hourglass is almost empty. When the investigators began to sort out the incident, the dry figures of the report turned into a living story. From the technical side, everything looked perfect. The aircraft was in good working order, the fuel was calculated according to all standards, and the procedures were followed. But in practice, it was the combination of human decisions and weather patterns that made the situation critical. The first layer of analysis is technical. Formally, the crew had a sufficient reserve. Upon departure, everything was in accordance with the norms. The remainder in the plans exceeded the emergency minimum by almost half. And even after the first departure, there was enough fuel for an alternative airfield. But each additional delay, each waiting lap, and the 2 subsequent departures ate up those tons so quickly that the airbag disappeared. The arithmetic of fuel is unbiased, it leaves no room for compromise. The second layer is the human factor. The commander decided to fly the plane himself when leaving for an alternate airfield. This gave him full control over management, but reduced his ability to control the big picture. Negotiations, calculations, strategy. The co-pilot, on the contrary, turned out to be overloaded radio traffic maps systems. The load was not distributed in the optimal way. The third layer is psychology. It was difficult for the crew to let go of Singapore. The closer they were to the target, the stronger the desire to land the plane there. Even when the storm front blocked both this option and some of the spare ones, the decision to leave took longer than it should have. This is a classic cognitive trap, the belief that a little more and it will get better. But in aviation, the best rarely comes at such moments. The contrast here is stark. Technology provides dry boundaries, fuel standards, wind limits, approach patterns, and psychology forces us to look for a chance to squeeze the situation. And it is in these intervals that critical moments are born. There are no accusations or strong language in the report. Instead, the emphasis is on the fact that a combination of weather factors and human decisions led to an extremely low fuel balance. For Singapore Airlines, this was an occasion to strengthen training. Now the programs include additional scenarios with unexpected weather developments, with an emphasis on early departure and work in conditions of uncertainty. This is how technology and psychology are intertwined in the sky. The machine is able to withstand huge loads, and people are able to make accurate decisions under pressure. But it is the combination of these two elements that determines whether a situation remains in the report as an incident without consequences or turns into a disaster. When the investigators analyzed the weather reports of that day, it became clear that the forecast was made correctly. Thunderstorms were indeed expected in the evening, visibility remained within the normal range, and alternate airfields looked suitable. But reality went the other way. The front turned out to be wider and more aggressive than expected by the models. Instead of local foci, a massive system formed, which closed several directions at once and moved faster than expected. This is an important signal for all aviation. Traditional forecasts are based on statistics and historical data, but the current climate adds a new level of complexity. Convective phenomena, thunderstorms, squalls, downpours began to develop more intensively. Their boundaries change within minutes, not hours. What until recently was a short-term thunderstorm can now develop into a front that covers an entire region and does not let it go for hours. The contrast here is striking. In the briefing room, the crew looked at the forecast where everything looked normal. And a few hours later, reality showed a picture that no checklist could predict. All the spare parts were in the precipitation zone at the same time. A scenario that was considered unlikely has become a fact. Therefore, for the first time, the report made a direct reference to climate change as a risk factor. This is rare in aviation, where it usually comes down to specific errors or technical failures. But here, the researchers recognize that conditions are becoming less predictable, and crews must prepare for more non-standard situations. Singapore Airlines has included this case in the training. Now pilots go through exercises where several replacements become unusable at the same time, and the decision to leave must be made in advance, without waiting for a critical mark. An important emphasis is placed on the fact that leaving is not a defeat, but the same professional procedure as boarding. The juxtaposition is visible again. Checklists teach you how to act consistently and confidently, but the atmosphere itself is increasingly acting chaotically and quickly. To balance these two poles, pilots need not only knowledge of procedures, but also a willingness to make decisions earlier than the minimum dictates. This incident has become a reminder. Technology is improving, forecasts are becoming more accurate, but the weather is always one step ahead. And the task of aviation is not to catch up with it, but to learn to respect its unpredictability. When the Singapore Airlines plane, exhausted by thunderstorms and second-round departures, finally touched down on the Batam Strip, the story ended safely. No one in the cabin realized how close they were to the border, where only a few minutes of flight could remain in the tanks. For the passengers, it was just a long flight with a delay. It was a difficult ordeal for the pilots, in which every kilogram of fuel was like a second on the clock, flowing faster than we would like. And then the main question arises, what is really worth being afraid of? An aircraft with serviceable systems and an experienced crew can withstand many things. Thunderstorms, squalls, even an automation failure. That's not what you need to be afraid of. The real danger lies in the small decisions that add up to a chain. Wait another lap. Try another pass. Do not leave for a backup in advance. It all seems like small things until the numbers on the fuel indicators become threatening. The contrast here is striking. There is an illusion of safety in the salon. Movies on the screens, food on the tables, jokes and sleep. In the cockpit, there is a struggle for every minute, cold calculations, and the voice of the dispatcher who can change the scenario with a single phrase. Below, there is wet concrete and streaks of lights that can either accept or be hidden behind a wall of rain. The history of this flight shows that the real strength of the crew is not to bring the plane to its destination at any cost, but to say no in time and go where there is a reserve. Being stubborn in aviation means playing against the arithmetic of fuel and against an atmosphere that does not forgive procrastination. Therefore, the conclusion is simple and paradoxical. It's not the sudden end of fuel that you should be afraid of. You need to be afraid of delays in decision-making, because time always flows faster in the sky than on Earth. It was this lesson that the crew took with them, and the airline integrated it into the training. And the viewer is left with only one question. If you were in the cockpit at the moment when the fuel needle was falling below the minimum, would you choose to take the risk again, or would you say, let's leave now?